Boa tarde, tudo bem? Estamos aqui novamente, mais um Tiaços, chegando perto do final do ano, de um ano difícil, cansativo, mas estamos aqui potentes e felizes para receber Jennifer Sandoval. Jennifer, prazer imenso te receber entre nós. Queria te apresentar formalmente para o nosso grupo. Jennifer é psicóloga clínica, diretora do programa de psicologia clínica da Pacifica Graduate. Ela é membro do comitê executivo da Sociedade Internacional de Psicologia como disciplina da interioridade, autora do livro Uma Investigação Psicológica sobre o Significado e o Conceito do Perdão, e coeditora de um livro de ensaios Psicologia da Disciplina da Interioridade, né? A diferença psicológica no trabalho de Wolfgang Giegerich. Jennifer, um imenso prazer te receber. Há muito tempo que a gente queria convidá-la. É um prazer ter lido seus textos. Tenho te acompanhado bastante nas suas publicações e é uma oportunidade para nós, da comunidade junguiana brasileira, ter alguém que domina tão bem, que conhece com intimidade a obra do Wolfgang Giegerich. Sinta-se inteiramente à vontade para estar conosco, tá bom? Muito obrigado pela sua presença.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Isa. Thank you. I feel very honored to be invited to speak. I'm very excited that there are over 90 people interested in Giegerich. I think that that's quite heartening to me. So I was thinking maybe I would share my screen, but then maybe, can you all hear me? Okay. Maybe I will just read for a while, and you know, the other thing I wasn't quite sure of was the timing. And I wasn't sure how much time I should take to read, and then if we would want to have leave time for questions back. Sorry,
Jennifer, fique completamente à vontade. Geralmente as pessoas têm usado 45 minutos, 1 hora, mas fique à vontade em relação ao tempo, tá bom?
Great. Okay, wonderful. I will have to warn you. I have two little dogs that sometimes bark and run around, so I hope they stay quiet for the next hour. So, well, hopefully that will be the case. Okay. So I will just begin, and we'll see how it goes. Okay. So let's see. Hola y obrigado pelo seu convite. That's all I know. Okay. Okay. So psychology as the discipline of interiority, which is what we call Giegerich's style of psychology, originates from the body of thought developed by Jungian scholar and analyst Wolfgang Giegerich over the course of more than 3 decades. While the overall work of C.G. Jung is foundational to his thinking, Giegerich's rigorous and dialectical application of analytical psychology to itself identified and distilled Jung's most advanced, extraordinary, and subtle insights, forming a radical new basis from which to ground a modern psychology. In this, psychology is the discipline of interiority, which I will refer to as PDI for short, extends beyond the boundaries of analytical psychology into philosophy, Hegelian dialectics, and the abstract spirit of the soul in contemporary phenomena such as mass media, technology, digital communications, nuclear warfare, terrorism, and sophisticated neuroses. With this psychology, Giegerich has laid the groundwork that makes possible the catapulting of consciousness to a higher stage and status of itself, opening up the field of psychology as the study of the soul in the 21st century. Some years back, I gave a talk called Giegerich for Beginners at the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles. I can make that talk available to you if you'd like. I had thought I would merely slightly update the original talk and present that to you today. However, in rereading the earlier paper, there was very little in it that resonated with me now. And it dawned on me that the concepts I had presented then exist as sublated ideas for me now. The concept of sublation is, in fact, very important to Giegerich's work and contains within it a contradiction, another crucial concept of PDI, of an idea being both kicked upstairs and preserved. So present in a kind of ghostly integrated sense, but no longer pulsing and alive in the present. What I mean to say is that the foundational concepts of psychology as the discipline of interiority are largely in the eye of the beholder. You could very well invite a different speaker and hear an entirely distinct set of ideas that are equally valid. So I will share with you today, in our brief time together, the ideas from PDI that I really enjoy and have the most resonance for me at this point in my studies. As you read Giegerich, you will discover ideas that speak to you and move you. The point here is to read Giegerich for yourself and not take my word for it. The importance of soul in psychology. One thing I love about Giegerich, about his work, is how unabashed he is about the importance of soul in psychology. For him, to construe a psychology without soul is as absurd as would be a biology that had given up the notion of life. Paradoxically, between Jung, James Hillman, and Giegerich, Giegerich frames soul as the most elusive to us. We glean its ethereal existence only from the residue it leaves behind in the substantive form of art, poetry, music, literature, history, and soul events. Soul exists only as absence, its form, the formlessness of absolute negativity. In the same way, we might say that God has to be experienced negatively. God cannot be perceived or imagined. Even genuine visions of God are not a positive seeing or imagining. They are negations of such seeing, sublated perception. The most important thing to keep in mind here is that the notion of the soul is logically negative. Thus, soul is quite different than the traditional notion often found in analytical literature, as psychologically the soul does not exist as a static entity. It is not, for example, the substantive, a priori, feminine, benevolent, personal, or for us soul that may appear in Jungian psychology. The soul is expressly not substantiated, not given, not imbued with human characteristics, and certainly not for us. Where the soul does not stir, where it does not produce feelings, ideas, symptoms, dreams, works of art or culture, there simply is no soul. A joke here may aid in illustrating the logically negative nature of soul. A German worker gets a job in Siberia during the reign of Stalinism. Aware that all, aware that, Twinkie, sorry. Twinkie, come here, honey. Oh. I may have to go let the dog out. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. Twinkie, come here, honey. Oh, I can't find her, so we'll just keep going. Okay, here's the joke. A German worker gets a job in Siberia during the reign of Stalinism. Aware that all correspondence will inevitably be read by censors, he tells his friends, "Let's establish a code. If a letter you receive from me is written in ordinary blue ink, it is true. If a letter you receive, if it is written in red ink, it is false. So blue ink, it's true. Red ink, it's false." After a month, his friends get the first letter written in blue ink. It says, "Everything is wonderful here. Stores are full, food is abundant, apartments are large and properly heated, movie theaters show films from the West, there are many beautiful people ready for an affair. The only thing unavailable is red ink." How does this joke relate to the soul as absolutely negative? Let us consider the ordinary blue ink as the language and form of daily life, of things in their appearing or semantic form. The red ink would then signify the simple negation of those forms, but still in the same language and on the same logical or semantic level. The knowledge that the red ink is missing, however, negates the presence of the red ink, thus serving to convey the blue ink in its absolutely negated form as the missing red ink. In other words, the knowledge that the red ink is missing is able to convey the real truth of the blue ink as untrue. Psychologically speaking, the ego writes in blue ink and insists that what it writes is true. Otherwise, it would simply be written in red ink. It can only conceive of a simple negation, or red ink, for it does not discern the psychological difference. While everything the soul writes has to be written in blue ink, psychology knows that the red ink is missing. A true psychology then thinks as the missing red ink. In this, the missing red ink in our joke signifies the absolute negative status of soul as departed or absent, not present, but certainly not nothing. The soul's presence as absence is signified by the knowledge that red ink is missing, indicating a logical form of soul as thought. Such knowing allows us to comprehend the truth in its essence, absolved from its own literal blue ink truth. Because soul exists as syntax, or the form of form, it is invisible and shows itself only indirectly on the semantic level as cultural expressions such as art, literature, media and the internet, nuclear arsenals, capitalism, political movements, etc. In other words, all written in blue ink by the objective psyche as its self-expression in the world. But these are mere expressions, not soul itself. Soul, as absolutely negative, is not a substance, but pure process, and can only live for us as missing. So to reiterate, the soul must not be positivized. It does not exist, but this does not mean at all that it is simply nothing. Indeed, for Giegerich, soul is where we find ourselves. In the deepest sense, we exist not as organism, but as soul or Geist. Are we okay so far? Okay, good. That was probably the hardest part in terms of understanding the absolute negativity of the soul in Giegerich's thinking. Our relation to soul. What is the implication here for our relation to soul? For Jung, the relation is to discern and amplify the presence and wisdom of the soul, to attempt a connection or bridge between the conscious and unconscious contents of the psyche, to forge a conscious relation with the soul. For James Hillman, we listen for the soul, for what the soul wants of us. How is the soul speaking to me now? How might it guide me? We let the soul of the world, the anima mundi, tell us what she wants. For Giegerich, the primary concern of the psychologist is what the soul is saying about itself through whatever phenomenon may present itself. The soul and ego personality exist in logically different dimensions. Hence, there is no connection between the ego and the soul. I would note that from a psychological perspective, there is a truly problematic promise commonly made to the analysand seeking Jungian analysis. The impossible promise is that one could ever cultivate an abiding or personal connection with soul or the self. This is because there is no substantive existing soul anymore. The soul is not a positivity, not psychic, but psychological. It is not competent for ego excitement and for peak experience, but only very soberly and quietly for its own truth. The soul in modernity no longer is substantiated as it was historically in nature, the gods, rituals, or religion. Soul has taken leave of its earlier form of substantiated subjectivity and now finds itself in the modern subjective I, in the pure form, of concept of psychology, which is nothing but a methodological approach or style of seeing and perhaps being. This forecloses on the possibility of a patient's developing a connection with a greater personality, the self, as described in Edinger's ideal of a self-oriented ego. Edinger writes, "The image of Christ gives us a vivid picture of the self-oriented ego. In other words, the individuated ego, which is conscious of being directed by the self." He even asserts the added bonus of a connection with his transpersonal source, which loves him and supports him. But in accordance with PDI, this is not psychology. The promise psychotherapy offers of personal contact with soul, which loves them and supports them, is an impossible one. I will add another unfortunate promise being made to the patient, which is that a patient's own individuation matters in a transcendent way. In other words, that the salvation of the world depends on one's own personal salvation. To jump over to psychoanalysis for a minute, analyst Adam Phillips notes two common cliches about the function of psychoanalysis. The first is that it will ease suffering. You suffer trauma, depression, etc., and psychoanalysis helps you understand it. Then you can still suffer, but it becomes banal and bearable rather than existential. The second cliche is that psychoanalysis serves as a form of self-knowledge, a way to understand oneself. But these are false purposes, according to Phillips. The true function of psychoanalysis is to bring the patient to a place in which they stop mattering to themselves. You are cured when you no longer matter to yourself. We might also say this recognition of one's immateriality is a function of the Hegelian notion of knowing one's limit, or the recognition that I am only that. Or, as Giegerich puts it, Slavoj Žižek, the goal of psychoanalysis is to bring you to the point when you can finally forget about that piece of bullshit that is yourself and work for a cause. The point is not to ease your suffering, but enable you to get out of these categories of personal suffering and pleasure. Žižek is not here saying that the point is to convince oneself that one no longer matters in the way of no longer being selfish, etc. No, to get out of the categories of suffering and pleasure altogether means a recognition that such categories are fundamentally irrelevant to soul. One doesn't have to convince oneself. It just dawns on one as a psychological truth. It is important to understand that what is impossible is a personal relationship to soul. An objective relation is possible and necessary from the soul's perspective to the extent that the ego personality gives way. The human subject is, as it were, merely the antenna or the receiver which, however, makes the soul's self-relation not only audible, but also possible in the first place. The human subject is merely a moment in the soul's self-relation, and yet also its precondition. Soul utilizes the individual as an instrument for its self-expression, for example, in the creation of art or literature. Giegerich writes, "What makes a poet a true poet is precisely their capacity to allow themselves to become sublated as a being in their own right, and to become instead an integral moment of the self-production of their poem." Okay, now we'll go on to the psychological difference. I wonder if I should look at the chat. Okay. As is obvious by now, PDI is a decidedly non-ego psychology. Giegerich, like Hillman and Jung before him, is concerned to stress a non-egoic hegemony of the psyche. According to Jungian analyst and author Greg Mogensen, Giegerich's most important contribution to psychology resides in his having rigorously thought psychology through in terms of what Giegerich calls the psychological difference. Indeed, one of the most crucial concepts of psychology, and one on which the entirety of a true psychology rests, is the idea of the psychological difference. While the psychological difference is a rather complex notion, it can be most simply defined by nature of its two parts, the psychic on the one hand and the psychological on the other, and the recognition of the difference between these two dimensions. While psychic life includes all those aspects of the human organism, such as one's biology, emotions, feelings, thoughts, instincts, and fantasies. Psychological life, on the other hand, is about the inner life of the soul, or the question of what, in fact, psychology is. Giegerich writes, true psychology depends on the awareness of what I call the psychological difference, the kind of analogy to Heidegger's ontological difference. It is the difference that runs through the meaning of the word psychology itself, and divides psychology as the account of the psychologies that people have, personalistic psychology, from psychology as description of the life of the soul. Put most simply, the psychological difference is the difference between ego and soul, between positivity and interiority, between semantics and syntax, and between the contents of consciousness and the logical form of consciousness. From the Kena Upanishad, we read, not what the eyes can see, but what opens the eyes is the Brahma. A most apt description of the psychological difference. With regards to the psychological difference in psychotherapy, Giegerich also notes, the psychological difference render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, helps to avoid the two dangers that go along with the therapeutic approach unaware of the difference. First, the danger of becoming personalistic and positivistic, as often in developmental psychology. And secondly, the danger of mystification, unnecessarily inflating the patient's life and experiences with mythic importance, seeing the patient's process as his individuation in the loaded Jungian sense, operating with the search for wholeness and meanings, etc. As a clinician, I meet regularly with other psychologists and consult on patient cases where we analyze each case in light of the psychological difference and attempt to discern the psychic from the psychological aspects. What is the soul saying about itself through this symptom, this neurosis? Or is it more a matter of a psychic problem, such as a response to trauma that needs attention in the patient? In analysis, if the psychological difference between ego and soul is not continuously and relentlessly discerned by the analyst, the false sense of oneself is protected, especially if it seems able to distinguish itself from ego. The problem we face here is that any substantiated self, even the part of one that tries to distinguish itself from one's ego, is itself ego, is the substantiated neurotic soul. When the ego, in its blindness, stumbles over something, even if it should in fact be the soul, it only finds more ego, but not soul. That is a quote from Giegerich. Yet in analysis, that version of the self is unwittingly validated as a real, independent, thinking self or consciousness, the aware personality that individuates, contributes, matters, and is somehow mystically meant, whose realness and validity seem self-evident. And is left safely unquestioned. Distinguishing oneself from the ego is a simple negation on the semantic level. The negation of the negation, which would mean de-identification from the very sense of oneself, a release from one's own self-concept, does not occur very often. in analysis and is understandably resisted. It might seem that this absolute negation would destroy the ego, but there really is no ego to destroy or sacrifice at the soul level. Emerging instead is the comprehension of oneself as existing contradiction. I'll say that again. Emerging instead is the comprehension of oneself as existing contradiction, as the unity of the difference between the soul as subject and comprehending, appreciating, conscious instrument through which the soul expresses itself on the one hand, and the finite ego on the other. Eachness and interiorization, new section here. Greg Mogensen said to us once, drown in it and grow gills. And I really like this saying, drown in it and grow gills. So this is very applicable to this section. As you may know, one of Jung's favorite catchphrases was hic Rhodus, hic salta, which basically boils down to the phrase, this is it. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung writes, for me, irreality was the quintessence of horror, for I aimed, after all, at this world and this life. No matter how deeply absorbed or blown about I was, I always knew that everything I was experiencing was ultimately directed at this real life of mine. I meant to meet its obligations and fulfill its meaning. My watchword was hic Rhodus, hic salta. Similarly, for Giegerich, each real situation, each dream, each image comes with the invitation to us to say to it, this is it. Hic Rhodus, hic salta. This is it implies a double presence. One, I am here reporting for duty, as it were, and unconditionally staking myself. Two, this situation that I am in has, regardless of what it is like, everything it needs, and thus also the potential of its fulfillment within itself. Here and now, in this life of mine, in this world, must be the place of ultimate fulfillment. Implicit here is a critique of the modern search for meaning. Giegerich writes, our modern striving in psychology for our self-development, self-actualization, and individuation, as well as our longing for meaning, belong to the sphere of practical gain and revolve around the ego. They have nothing, or at best only little, to do with soul. The wish for meaning is a wish for self-gratification. Ego also refers to the greedy ego in its mindless and desperate attempts for gratification. Opposing this stance would be the mind's thinking capacity to apperceive the fullness of what is right in front of it. An example of this mindful relation to life is described by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. He writes, when you contemplate the big full sunrise, the more mindful and concentrated you are, the more the beauty of the sunrise is revealed to you. Suppose you are offered a cup of tea, very fragrant, very good tea. If your mind is distracted, you cannot really enjoy the tea. You have to be mindful of the tea. You have to be concentrated on it, so the tea can reveal its fragrance and wonder to you. That is why mindfulness and contemplation are such sources of happiness. That's why a good practitioner knows how to create a moment of joy, a feeling of happiness at any time of the day. Hans' description begins to approach Giegerich's notion of interiority. Interiority, as conceived in PDI, is not interiority in a traditional sense. It is not the interiority that might be used by a phenomenologist to describe the things in themselves, for example, as in a rich phenomenological description or amplification of a particular phenomenon. This would only be interiority on the horizontal or semantic level of appearance, and not on what Giegerich describes as the vertical or syntactical level of the soul. Nor is interiority that part of the human person that resides inside, as in one refers to the psychodynamic life of the human being. This still has not transgressed the horizontal plane at which psychic life occurs. Interiority, rather, ouroborically refers to the interior life of the soul as such, the inner truth of psychology as it becomes conscious of itself, wherein the soul is not the literal in itself external inwardness in man, not traditional psychology's the unconscious, but the soul's inwardness in itself, absolute interiority. The infinite interiority of the soul is reached through a logical act, that of the dialectical negation of externality as such, or the dialectical interiorization into absolute negativity. In our example of the tea, the negation of exterior distracted impulses allow for concentrated mindfulness upon the subject. As the ego personality is left behind, the mind finds itself drowning in the subject matter and dropping into its inner infinity, invited to witness the delightful revelation of fragrance and wonder in a simple cup of tea. Okay, dialectics. Psychology, as the discipline of interiority, employs a dialectical method of inquiry and analysis, being an inherent theoretical, speculative, and critical psychology. For in allowing the underlying thought process of the subject matter at hand to reach its logical conclusion, psychological thinking must inevitably negate those ideas it encounters that have failed to further develop, or having been reified and concretized, become frozen in their tracks. The ego experience of such negation is predictably a threatening or caustic one of criticism, invalidation, or rejection. Yet in identifying and negating fixed or stagnant ideas, in identifying and negating fixed or stagnant ideas, consciousness can further itself, in effect pushing off from its position into ever-deepening knowledge of itself. In his writings, Giegerich frequently distinguishes between the semantic or content level of consciousness and the syntactic level of its overall structure or form. Change at the semantic level merely involves a shifting around of the contents of consciousness in the light of their having been contradicted in some way. This shifting around, however, as extensive as it may be in many cases, poses no challenge to the form of consciousness. None of its contents, that is to say, has yet become the straw that breaks the camel's back. In the negation of the negation, by contrast, the camel's back is broken, the structure of consciousness torn asunder. With Giegerich's characterization of psychological evolution as dialectical in nature, we are presented with a different dynamic of the development of consciousness from Jung's transcendent function. Instead of a conflict of two fundamental opposites held in tension, we encounter a dynamic based upon commitment to a single initial idea or position. The dialectical process does not begin with two, but with one, with a position. There is, at first, no opposition to this position, no alternatives. Rather, by committedly sticking to this one position that it holds, the mind discovers, or is forced to admit, that this position proves untenable. It does not hold up. This experience amounts to a negation of the initial position. If before the position was A, the negation of the position results in non-A, a contradiction to the original position. The negation, if tested again, proves to be untenable and is accordingly negated. So we get the negation of the negation, not non-A. But the negation of the negation as such is absolute negation, and as such, the reinstitution of the original position of A. However, it is now the position on a fundamentally new level, because it is no longer the naive, immediate position of the beginning as a simple given, but mediated and tremendously enriched by the history of all the negations and as their net result. It has been greatly differentiated, is much more subtle, refined. Nothing has been lost or discarded through the negations. The superseded stages are still there, however, now only as sublated moments within the new position. On this new level, the dialectical process can then begin once more with the differentiated results as its starting point, in other words, as the new position. It may help here to recognize that with a true negation, that which is negated is not fully lost, but rather sublated, having fulfilled its function as an integral moment of the logical life of which it is a part, such as the blossom gives way to the fruit. As Hegel explains, the bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, when the fruit comes, the blossom may be explained to be a false form of the plant's existence, for the fruit appears as its true nature in place of the blossom. The ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes these stages moments of an organic unity, where they not merely do not contradict one another, but where one is as necessary as the other and constitutes thereby the life of the whole. What are some examples of the dialectic? First example. A colleague of mine sees a patient who is a priest. His patient shared the following experience. I am visiting a hospital room to offer Holy Communion to a very ill patient. When I open the door, I see the dying woman on the bed, surrounded by family and friends, tenderly holding her and singing to her. I realized later that though I initially thought I was there to give communion, I was in fact receiving it by entering their midst. The priest's realization is an example of consciousness elevated to the vertical or psychological dimension. The priest realizes or recognizes the inner truth of the meaning of Holy Communion. His comprehension of the notion is absolved from its literal definitional constraints, for example, the breaking of bread and partaking of wine, and released into its infinite truth as a living expression of logical love. Communion as a living embodied act of remembrance and recognition of the soul returning to itself as love. Giegerich describes how the logic of the process of symbolization is dialectical. This is quite complex, so reading it through once may not convey it, but I'll do it anyway. And I'll make this paper available so that you can read it if you'd like to. But Giegerich is able to describe quite easily how the process of symbolization is dialectical. So he says, the invisible soul or logic expresses itself first in symbolic garb. For example, in a sexual phenomenon. Secondly, the phenomenal aspect of the symbol negates itself as follows. I, the way I look, am not what I am about. I am not really about sexuality at all. Thirdly, the phenomenal aspect of the symbol points to some other hidden invisible as to that which it is actually about. Fourthly, the symbol says, but only through me, this my garb, can you get an access to this other. Fifthly, because my meaning is absolutely negative, I really mean nothing, but not nothing in the sense of total emptiness. The symbol in this internal drama occurring simultaneously, which is a logical drama, the logic of the symbol as a circular Ouroboros logic. I'll give you one more example. Ibram X. Kendi offers another example of the dialectic in his book about racism. He begins by describing the initial position A, of the racist as one who harbors racist ideas. He writes, a racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Racist ideas argue that the inferiorities and superiorities of racial groups explain racial inequities in society. Upon further reflection and awareness, the negated position would be achieved, namely the relinquishment of the idea of such discrimination based on race. One might then declare themselves to be a non-racist or race neutral. So that would be the negated position. However, according to Kendi, the most threatening racist movement is not the alt-right's unlikely drive for a white ethno-state, but the regular Americans' drive for a race-neutral one. The construct of race neutrality actually feeds white nationalist victimhood by positing the notion that any policy protecting or advancing non-white Americans toward equity is reverse discrimination. So here again, we see the negated position does not logically hold up. To merely deny that one is racist is to stay on the same logical level or reality of the racist. What is needed is an absolute negation, which results in the notion of anti-racism. An anti-racist is any idea, this is Kendi writing. An anti-racist is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. The dialectic involves the absolute negation of the logical form of the content from within itself, which arrives back at the starting point, albeit a transformed starting point. In Kendi's example, anti-racism allows for the original idea of discrimination in an objective sense, wherein if discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. Furthermore, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must treat them differently. Kendi's discussion on the phenomenology of anti-racism is quite remarkable, wherein notions such as beauty, culture, class, and power are explored from the new landscape made possible by the dialectic. Okay, soul events. In PDI, we find the notion of a soul event, which allows us to detect whether an experience is a function of soul or merely a positive factual event in the semantic sense. What distinguishing characteristics do we find in soul events that identify them as such? Giegerich writes, soul events objectively come to the experiencing subject as a kind of thou. They have a meaning, or rather, they are events of meaning. They have logos character and the quality of consciousness. They are in themselves linguistic. They speak. They are intriguing and contain a mystery. A soul event does not refer to any other event outside itself. It has the subject quality or consciousness quality immediately within itself, within its objectivity. This is why it is experienced as significant and meaningful for ourselves as persons, as humans, not merely important for us as animals, the way, for example, medical results or natural catastrophes are important for us. An event of soul stops us in our tracks as we are suddenly overcome with a recognition of truth. What stops you in your tracks? A work of art, a film, a poem. One knows one has encountered a soul event the moment one's heart sinks or jumps with joy. What I'd like to do now, talk about now, is an interiorization of the notion of projection. Giegerich often will take a concept that is familiar to us in analytical psychology and work with it and interiorize it. And there are interesting results often when he does this. So this was one of my favorite essays of his when I started to read Giegerich. So it was it's called The Leap After the Throw, and it's found in volume 1 of his collected English papers. So The Leap After the Throw. While the primary work of psychoanalysis is to identify and integrate unconscious projections, Giegerich is critical of the typical concept of withdrawing projections due to its inherent protection of the ego. Projection describes the subject ejecting an internal unconscious content out into the external world from a fixed place. One might imagine a person throwing a stone from the shore or a spear into the forest, with a therapeutic expectation of withdrawing the projection back inside of oneself. According to Giegerich, what turns projection into a psychological problem is that the movement stops with the throw. Such stopping at the throw is an abortive move by the ego, in that one's focus is trained on the object rather than on how the object is seen, on the entity itself rather than one's relationship with it. The undefended instinctive lunge after the projection is suppressed, and the possible sloughing off of the ego by exposure to a new territory is prevented. The ego remains unmoved and intact. Quote, "The intent is always to achieve change, but to keep the subject as something fixed out of the process and to immunize him from transformation. In not leaping after the projected content, we avoid being transformed by it. Rather than entering into the experience of the relationship, enduring the torment and exhilaration and transformation of desire or timos, we stand still, fixed upon the object of desire." What if we were to leap after the projection and go into the world and get it? In leaping after the throw, projection then opens up to one's soul the whole world as its inner space. It procures for the soul an extendedness over the world so that it begins to carry its title anima mundi with full right. It is as if we cannot really reclaim our soul until we have been transformed by the world we experience in the very act of catching up with the projection. Such a leap entails fully engaging in life, leaping into the chaos of our shadow aspects, surrendering to the enormity and vulnerability of falling in love, or allowing oneself to be undone by suffering and rage from a devastating betrayal. The leap signals a relinquishing of the ego's defended posture, a surrendering into that which is greater than the ego, and a willingness to allow the complex its function. The leap has us jump in after the stone we threw and begin to thrash about and swim, or set off into the jungle into which we threw our spear, so to speak. We allow ourselves to become changed and transformed by the whole world, and only through that experience can we earn the projection back. Are we allowed to reclaim the gift we threw away? Okay, well, I think I will stop there. So if there are any questions or comments.
Obrigado, Jennifer. Agora a gente sabe sabe com maior clareza por que a obra do Giegerich causa tanto tremor na comunidade junguiana. Jennifer, a gente vai começar o debate. A gente vai começar o debate. As pessoas que quiserem fazer perguntas, coloquem seus nomes. Eu vou começar com duas questões, Jennifer. Tem dois conceitos, por assim dizer, que o Giegerich usa, que geralmente eles são mal compreendidos pela comunidade junguiana. Queria que você falasse um pouco disso. Um é a ideia do pensamento psicológico, que não se confunde com a função pensamento, como Jung propõe. Queria que você pudesse falar um pouco disso. E a outra é a própria noção de dialética. Volta e meia, quando nós falamos de dialética no campo junguiano ou na teoria, a referência é um pouco a função transcendente. E me parece que o Giegerich já apontou que não se trata disso. Então, queria que você pudesse um pouco falar sobre esses dois mal-entendidos. O que é o pensamento psicológico para o Giegerich, que não se confunde com a função pensamento do Jung, e a noção de dialética, que também não se confunde com o modo como nós pensamos a função transcendente da maneira como Jung a formulou.
Yeah. Those are very good questions. I think that the question about thought and the distinction between Giegerich's notion of what he means by thought versus the thinking function is very important because they're quite different. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is read an excerpt about that so that I'm accurate in describing it, the difference. So I need to find it, and it's in we write about this difference in the introduction to this book. And I would like to read that part for you briefly. So I will read, okay, let me find it. Right. Okay.
Você está bem, Isa?
Actually, you know, I have it. Hold on, let me look on my computer really quickly here. No, it isn't. It's actually in, gosh, let's see. Oh, I know. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, I think I found it. Okay, so let me read to you just a little excerpt. So thinking in terms of PDI needs to be distinguished from the thinking function, from Jung's thinking function. So Giegerich writes, it cannot be stressed enough. Thought is not a function, even though what Jung called the thinking function is, of course, one moment in developed explicit thought. Thought is the quinta essentia of and beyond all four functions. It is the breakthrough to an entirely different level of logic, or the notion. And this is the Hegelian idea of notion. Basically, thought is the soul's, or the whole man's, openness to what is. So this is where he is describing what he means by thought. So thought is the soul's openness to what is, the capacity to express and respond to the truth of the age. It is what allows the human being to enter Actaeon's wilderness, to extend into the realm of origins and preexistence. What is meant by thought in this context is therefore not abstract, but living thought, or better, logical movement, logical life. Returning to the notion of soul, it is our active thinking that grants access to the soul level of consciousness. Soul is only in the doing, in the act or process of awareness, feeling, appreciation, thinking comprehension. I'm not sure if that helps, but he basically places the thinking function, soul's thinking function, as one moment in the developed explicit notion of thought. So thought contains the thinking function. It is that aspect that allows us an interaction with soul. As far as the transcendent function and the difference between the dialectic and the transcendent function, the transcendent function, often the way it's imagined is that there are two poles of opposites in tension, held in tension. And by holding the tension, something emerges on a different level. The third, we would say, right? With the dialectic, you can imagine that dialectic more like beginning with no conflict. It just begins with a position. And the position, as it's explored, as it's kind of sort of lived into, there becomes a recognition that it doesn't hold up. There must be a better way. It's almost like you're on one position and you feel like you're stuck or kind of pushing into a brick wall, like there's no other way. But there must be another way. And so in the recognition of there must be another way, a negation happens. So now we go into what we call the second position, or the negated position. But the phenomenology is different than the transcendent function, where you're holding both in tension. With the dialectic, you're really only ever in one position. And so then you're in the negated position, and that you live into, and you see where that again isn't the whole picture. And the process, it can be very painful in terms of breaking through to what we call an absolute negation. Giegerich has some interesting essays on transcending into an absolute negation. Ways of doing that. One is transcending, one is breaking through. I can send some the names of those essays, but it's quite a different phenomenology than the transcendent function. And then, in a way, when you're breaking through to an absolute negation, often what will happen is you see a much broader view of the whole situation. Yeah.
Obrigado, Jennifer. Eu vou chamar o André Dantas para fazer uma pergunta, mas eu queria apresentar o André Dantas. O André é um psicólogo que estuda Jung e Giegerich há muitos anos, e ele foi o responsável, Jennifer, pela tradução do Vida Lógica da Alma, do Giegerich, para o português. Teve essa coragem, hercúlea.
Nice to meet you.
E é um livro que vai sair no primeiro semestre da Vozes. O André teve a coragem de fazer essa tradução e é um prazer tê-lo aqui com a gente, tá bom? André, contigo.
Hello, Jennifer. Bom, eu vou falar devagar para facilitar para a Isa, né?
Wonderful.
Então, eu vou falar aqui devagar. E eu traduzi convencido pelo Marcão, né? Porque várias vezes eu amaldiçoei ele, mas enfim, deu certo. Bom, eu vou te perguntar, não sei se é possível responder, né? Se é viável responder no tempo que a gente tem, né? Porque é uma dúvida que eu fico em relação à obra do Giegerich, que é o modo como ele lida com a relação entre o ego e a alma, né? Eu não sei se eu estou entendendo muito bem, mas me parece que é como se fossem duas leituras que me parecem contraditórias. A primeira, né, que é a que você enfatizou muito no início da tua fala, né, que é a separação, a diferença entre o ego e a alma. Né? Inclusive, ele usa a metáfora, né, aquela metáfora marxista, da serpente que deixa a pele para trás. Né? A serpente troca de pele, e essa pele que fica para trás seria, né, a alma troca de pele, e essa pele que fica para trás seria o ego. É como se o ego desse conta daquilo que não é mais atual, daquilo que ficou obsoleto em relação à alma. Essa seria a primeira leitura, que enfatizaria a diferença. Não sei se estou entendendo bem. Mas tem outra leitura que ele faz, que é mais inspirada no Hillman, que no Hillman, no final do livro dele sobre a ânima, né, ele vai enfatizar que a ânima está sempre incisível com o ânimo. Então, o ego, ele seria uma ideia do ânimo, né? Seria aquela ideia do ânimo, do que o ânimo se pensa como fora da cisígia com a ânima. Que ele enfatiza muito isso no texto que ele fala, né, sobre o conto de fadas do Barba Azul. Ele termina esse texto, né, com o conto do noivo ladrão, onde ele coloca que, né, como se o ego ele fosse uma espécie de matança que a alma faz sobre ela mesma. Uma ficção que a alma cria de algo que está fora dela mesma. Então o ego ele estaria dentro da alma, mas fantasiando, ficcionalizando, achando que está fora da alma. Então é uma alma que se pensa como fora de si mesma quando continua dentro de si mesma. É uma espécie de ficção. E me parece que até uma certa matança, uma espécie de matança moderna, onde a alma mata a si mesma, né, e se torna ego, né, que é o desencantamento do mundo, a objetificação. Inclusive, me parece que ele faz essa leitura, ajuda ele a perceber alguns fenômenos modernos, né, como a globalização, a financiarização do mercado, a economia especulativa, a tecnologia moderna, como não sendo fenômenos do ego, né, que geralmente nós junguianos tendemos a achar como sendo fenômenos de um excesso de ego. Né, e ele vê como sendo uma forma moderna da alma, e não como ego. Né, ele inverte essa leitura. E me parece que essa leitura estaria mais próximo de enxergar o ego, né, dessa segunda maneira como uma parte da alma que fantasia, que acha que está fora de si mesmo, e como isso sendo uma espécie de matança moderna. Como é que dá para conciliar as duas? Assim, não sei se eu estou entendendo bem, mas às vezes me parecem leituras excludentes, sabe? Isso é uma leitura onde o ego, né, é uma coisa que a alma deixou para trás, e a outra leitura onde o ego é uma matança que a alma faz sobre si mesma, e o ego está fantasiando que está fora da alma, como ele está dentro da alma o tempo todo. Não sei se é possível você responder, se eu estou entendendo tudo errado, mas me parece como se fossem leituras que às vezes eu não consigo combinar as duas, sabe?
Well, that's, I would say, very interesting, these like two different interpretations. The thinking I have with regard to the ego is, at least from what I'm reading, and this is more recent than the Bluebeard essay, but the idea of the ego as an instantiation of what Giegerich calls the neurotic soul, which is really the neurotic soul is only that aspect of the soul that resists its own truth. It is stubborn, and it doesn't go along with the soul movement, the evolving of the soul. So the degree to which that aspect of the soul itself is manifested in us, it becomes the ego. Now that's very, in a sense, different than the ego in terms of psychologically. The ego is really that it's a set of defenses. It's the self-concept based on history. It's our own narrative. And so there is kind of a different way that Giegerich speaks of the ego. The way I talked about the ego today is more about the personal ego. It's the obstacle that in a sense, because we often so identify completely with the ego, we don't know who we are. We're not conscious of anything else. But in terms of the animus aspect, the animus function of the syzygy, where you have anima and animus, and you need the animus, like you said, the killing aspect. That killing aspect, in a sense, it is able to slough off or kind of move the soul forward. It kills itself into its own evolution. You know, and so the extent to which the ego, I guess, where the ego unconsciously may fulfill that function, the animus function, we could say yes, that would be, you could say, but the ego is just unconscious by design. It doesn't know what it's doing. It could definitely be used by, so to speak, the animus function of the soul. But in terms of the personal ego, where I didn't talk about neurosis. There were so many topics I wanted to add and talk about. But I think neurosis is one that was very important that I would like to talk some more. I wish I could talk more about. Because the other thing too is the telos of the soul. Like, what is the soul even trying for? What is the movement of the soul? What does it mean to resist that movement? You know, Giegerich would say, historically, the anima aspect of the movement of the soul is instantiation, is manifestation, is substantive expressions of itself. And the animus movement is liberation, freeing oneself, freeing the soul from all of the substantive aspects, which is very terrifying to the modern ego. I mean, to the it resists this movement, right? I don't know how to answer your question any better than that.
Obrigada, esclareceu muito, mas porque realmente é bem denso, né? Foi ótimo sua fala. Eu tô lendo o seu livro sobre o perdão. Não sei se daria tempo, mas eu queria perguntar também se né, é possível o ego perdoar ou se só a alma perdoa, né? Se o perdão só é possível para a alma, se o ego não consegue perdoar. Né?
Well, just on that topic, when we talk about the self-consciousness, distinct from ego consciousness, self-consciousness has an awareness of its existence as a contradiction. And the self-consciousness can comprehend the position of the offense, or the meaning of the offense. It doesn't take it personally, yeah. And so it has much more latitude when we're talking about forgiveness and anything else, you know. And the other thing too is, one of the things also I wanted to say is that the soul consciousness lives right now. It's only ever right now. And offenses, injuries happened historically in the past, right? So it has kind of a vertical relation to the offense, which it brings us into a forgiving state.
Obrigado.
But I'm happy to give my email address and take questions. If you have any questions, we can talk via email. I'm very happy to do that, because I know I probably stirred up some things and didn't answer too many questions.
Foi ótimo, esclareceu muitas coisas.
Obrigado, André. Obrigado, amigo.
Valeu, abraço, Marcão.
Arthur, quer fazer uma pergunta?
Oi, se der tempo, queria
Olá,
fazer
Arthur,
uma perguntinha.
tudo bem?
Olá. Bom, primeiramente, queria parabenizar pela palestra, pelos organizadores. E, bem, eu sou psicólogo junguiano, mas eu também tenho uma formação na filosofia, eu estudo Hegel há algum tempo. E eu pergunto mais como estudante de Hegel do que, eu acho, como um leitor de Giegerich, porque eu não li muito ainda, estou no início, né? E aí me surgem algumas dúvidas. Bom, primeiro um comentário, né, que o Hegel gostava de uma frase do Fausto, do Goethe, e como é um autor, né, e uma obra que o Jung gosta muito, vale, eu acho, né, que o Mephistófeles dizia que ele é um espírito negativo, né? Então, pensando dessa forma, parece que o Fausto representaria ali essa diferença, né? Fiquei pensando nisso, né? No psíquico e o Mephistófeles ali como o psicológico, né? Mas, enfim, só uma ideia. E aí, sobre o absoluto, era uma primeira pergunta que eu queria fazer, porque para o Hegel, pelo que, né, do que eu estou estudando, no final da fenomenologia do espírito, chega ali no saber absoluto, né? E aí parece que a gente chegou ali num saber verdadeiro, mas pelo que eu estou entendendo, o absoluto que o Hegel está falando é uma espécie de deslocamento. É como se o conceito conseguisse se desgrudar de um mentalismo, ou seja, o conceito não é a produção da consciência, mas ele é uma produção em si mesmo, né? Um exemplo que um professor deu é a economia, porque a economia ela não foi criada pela cabeça de alguém. A gente está ali comprando, a gente está fazendo coisas, e é um próprio caminho que se faz. Então, quando, pela sua fala, essa foi a impressão que foi me dando também, que o Giegerich está usando a noção de absoluto nesse sentido de um caminho que se autoproduz, né? Que não é produzido por ninguém. E a minha segunda dúvida, se der tempo, é sobre a noção de anima mundi. Pelo que eu estou estudando no Hegel também, é porque existem várias interpretações de que o Hegel defenderia uma noção de anima mundi, né? No sentido de que existe como se fosse uma mente divina que tivesse, né, que fosse o espírito, algo assim, que tivesse coordenando as coisas. E, pelo que eu estou vendo, isso é falso, né? Isso é uma interpretação errônea. Ou seja, o Hegel parece que tem uma noção de conceito que é concreto, vivo e que tem alma. Ele fala de alma no texto, pelo menos da ciência da lógica. O conceito tem alma, que o conceito é vivo, né? E aí ele pega essa ideia de concreto no sentido de crescer com uma coisa que vai crescendo, né? Quase que regionalmente, e a coisa vai se ampliando, né? Vai crescendo. Ou seja, essa noção de anima mundi no Hegel não é pressuposta, é uma espécie de resultado, né? E aí eu fico pensando, será que o Giegerich está pensando dessa forma também? Ou ele está pressupondo uma ideia de anima mundi, né? Como se já tivesse lá uma mente divina que está coordenando tudo e não como algo que está crescendo de maneira concreta, né? Nesse sentido que eu estava falando, e que vai sendo constituído por essa negatividade absoluta, né? Bem, era essas minhas dúvidas.
I don't quite know how to answer those. I think I had a little trouble following the logic of the questions. I'm not sure. Are you asking a comparison between the Hegelian thought of the concept versus how Giegerich relates to it? Also, the anima mundi, I know I'm not familiar with anima mundi in Hegel. I'm thinking of it in terms of how James Hillman describes the anima mundi, the soul of the world, which is very phenomenological.
Bem, o que eu quis perguntar, não sei se ficou claro, desculpa, foi o Giegerich está pressupondo uma noção de anima mundi ou não? Ou seja, qual que seria a outra opção? O Giegerich percebe a anima mundi não como uma espécie de algo pronto, mas é algo que se constituindo praticamente como se fosse regionalmente e que foi se desenvolvendo, né? Mas não é pressuposta, como se antes, como se tudo fosse coordenado por uma mente divina. Essa é a minha pergunta. Ele está achando que somos coordenados por uma mente divina? Isso é uma anima mundi ou não? Ou isso é uma negatividade que se desenvolve, entende?
Yeah, very good. Okay, I see now. I understand. Thank you. Both. I think Giegerich would not admit to having a priori plan or existence of the soul's life. He talks a lot about the soul's logical life. And oftentimes implicit is this notion of a plan, an a priori plan that's kind of being acted out. The closest he gets to articulating that is his idea of the soul having a telos, that it is purposive. And the evolution of the soul, what he says, and I guess this could be in a sense pre-existing or a priori, although in actuality, soul does not exist, it is made. It isn't pre-existing. In fact, it depends on our on the human being for its self-expression, for its production. But to the extent that there is some kind of telos or existing plan, Giegerich says that the soul is attempting to come home to itself or to know itself as itself, unmediated. Right now, it's mediated. It's been mediated historically through the creations, through human creations and expressions. But in modernity, it's becoming less and less mediated. And that ultimately the movement is that for the soul to know itself directly. What that is, I don't know. Although he has said, and there are actually some times he talks about the substance or the idea of soul as love. And he uses a capital L. So that the soul itself exists invisibly. It doesn't exist, but the essence of it is love.
Obrigado, Arthur. Temos uma pergunta da Kátia Jennifer. Ela pergunta: o que Giegerich quer dizer quando fala que a análise começa com o analista morto?
Boy, these are not beginner questions. These are good questions. So there is a beautiful essay that I would recommend, because it's very difficult to explain, but it is called, oh, sorry, let me find it for you. And again, one of those that if you haven't read much Giegerich, this is one of the really, I think, helpful ones. Sorry. And it is right before the Bluebeard essay. And the soul always thinks. Is it? Oh. Okay, I think but the no, I can't find it. Oh, it's in Soul Violence, sorry. No, Soul Violence, sorry. It's there is an essay called the Animus as Negation and the Soul's Own Other, which is very helpful to answer, I think, that question. But the essay I would highly recommend is called First Shadow, Then Anima. First Shadow, Then Anima, and it's in Soul Violence. Basically in that essay, Giegerich goes into great detail about describing the stages of shadow integration. And where shadow, and I feel like I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't want to reduce it, but the idea is it talks about the development of consciousness from an understanding of itself to having life, to being life. It talks about the difference between our understanding of life as having our life, having life, and being, which is a vertical consciousness. And what it, in a sense, what it takes to come into that awareness. Only then would Giegerich say, now you can do analysis. So now the animus process can begin. So this is why it's a really, I think, very helpful essay to read because it describes the process, and it talks about it from the soul's perspective, not a personal perspective. But as you're reading, of course, there's a resonance there that as the reader can recognize the development of consciousness. So, but that would be in one way to understand, I think, the answer to that question.
Jennifer, há mais ou menos um mês atrás, eu troquei um e-mail com o Giegerich para falar sobre o lançamento da Vida Lógica da Alma, acertar alguns detalhes. E eu perguntei para ele sobre qual era a opinião dele sobre o lançamento dos livros negros do Jung. Ele respondeu que ele nem sabia que estavam sendo lançados e que ele não tinha o menor interesse em saber. Que interessava a ele o pensador Jung e não o homem Jung. Eu te pergunto, tomando em consideração o polêmico artigo do Giegerich sobre o livro vermelho, o que você acha? Qual é a opinião do Giegerich sobre o livro vermelho? Como é que você apresentaria essa ideia dele que, nesse momento onde os livros negros estão lançados e causando uma comoção, o Giegerich parece que aponta um lugar muito diferente disso, muito fora desse contágio coletivo. Qual é a tua impressão sobre?
My opinion. I think that for Giegerich, the Red Book lives on the level of the psychic. He does not view the Red Book as psychological, which I think is, very controversial to many who revere the Red Book. But I think, and it's been a long time since I've read his essay critiquing the Red Book, but what I'm remembering from it is he makes this distinction of how to define art. In other words, what speaks on the level of the objective psyche. And for him, the Red Book did not reach that level, did not break through onto the level of the objective psyche. That's all I really remember or could tell you about that.
Tá bom. Nadir, você queria fazer uma pergunta?
Oi, Jennifer, tudo bem? Obrigada por ter vindo aqui falar para a gente. Então, para fazer minha pergunta, eu tenho uma tendência a adquirir e ler muitos dos livros que o Marcos vai recomendando para o pessoal que faz parte do grupo dele. E uma vez ele trouxe o Neuroses, do Giegerich, e aí, como eu estava querendo saber muito a respeito de neurose, saber um pouco mais, eu fui na maior ingenuidade, adquiri o livro e comecei a ler. Eu digo ingenuidade porque eu achei, é um livro sobre neurose, eu vou ler, vai me ajudar, só que aí aquilo criou muitas dúvidas, muitas questões. Eu consegui terminar de ler a primeira parte. Daí o Marcos falou, se eu fosse você, eu ia lá ler o Dialectics and Analytical Soul. Aí eu comecei a ler esse e parei também. Eu falei, acho que não estou preparada para ler esses livros agora. Mas, de qualquer forma, eu tenho algumas anotações aqui comigo do Neuroses e fiquei com vontade de fazer uma pergunta para você sobre neurose. Ele, pelo que eu entendi, o Giegerich, ele faz uma diferenciação entre psique e o que é psíquico e o que é psicológico. Não sei se eu estou certa, mas eu percebi que ele faz uma diferenciação entre essas duas, vou chamar de dimensões. E ele diz que a neurose não é uma doença psíquica, que é uma doença psicológica. Que doenças psíquicas, vamos dizer, elas estão mais no nível biológico, se é que eu entendi bem. E que a neurose, ela não, por não estar nesse nível biológico, por não ser psíquica, ela está nessa dimensão psicológica, e que ela é algo que ela é gerada, ele é um arranjo que é gerado para si mesma, alguma coisa assim. Então, a minha pergunta é, então, para o Giegerich, a psique, ele coloca a psique num nível, vamos dizer, de estrutura cerebral, algo mais assim, e essa dimensão psicológica é algo que para nós, vamos dizer assim, para ele o que é psicológico é o que para mim seria psíquico. Entendeu a pergunta? Desculpa se eu fiz alguma confusão. Então, a questão é basicamente essa, se para ele o que é psíquico está dentro de uma dimensão de estrutura cerebral e o que é psicológico está para fora disso, vou dizer assim. Então, para ele, para Giegerich, o psicológico seria o que para nós, junguianos, seria o psíquico.
Okay, thank you for that question. in terms of the distinction that Giegerich makes between the psychic and the psychological with regard to neurosis, I like I like your description. I think that that's fairly accurate. I think that Giegerich would probably also include in the psychic like borderline personality disorders, personality disorders. That would also be included in the psychic realm. The psychological realm, where he's talking about a true neurosis, often the person experiencing the neurosis is suffering from it. It's something that they don't want. They're kind of really, it can be very humiliating to have a neurosis. In other words, it occurs like some other, like an other is with them, kind of forcing this upon them. You know, one of the, I think, most challenging aspects of that book that you're talking about, neurosis, is trying to understand, especially when we're working with patients, what is neurotic and what isn't. You know, what would actually, would we work with psychologically versus not? And I am curious about when you say, from a Jungian perspective, everything he described as psychic is psychological. That's, I mean, I wasn't even really aware that in Jungian, traditional Jungian practice, there is this distinction between psychological and psychic. I know one of the, you know, one of the biggest topics we have when we, in my consultation group, is trying to distinguish, is what's going on psychological? Is this a reflection of an objective level of the soul? Or is this strictly personal? Is this strictly an ego struggle or trauma or a developmental issue or like a mood disorder, that kind of thing? Because we would work with it differently, yeah, depending upon whether it's a true neurosis versus not.
Obrigado, Nadir.
Obrigada, Jennifer. Obrigada, Marcos.
Jennifer,
one thing, Nadir, I would recommend too, in the neurosis book, there is a back section, an appendix, where Giegerich goes through and describes many different types of neuroses that are very practical and are very helpful. So it's the very back part of the book that oftentimes we look to see how, oh, okay, this is how it actually manifests in patients. So it's very helpful.
Sim, muito obrigada.
Jennifer, queria fazer duas perguntas para a gente começar a finalizar o nosso encontro. Você cita muito o Zizek em vários dos seus textos. Você acha que a dialética que o Zizek usa é a mesma dialética que o Giegerich faz uso também? Quer dizer, há uma aproximação entre esses dois pensadores em torno da dialética? Essa é uma primeira pergunta, depois eu vou fazer outra depois, mas essa primeira, por favor.
I do. I don't think they know each other. I don't think they read each other. But I think from when you're looking at something similar to how to understand Giegerich, when we're looking in critical theory, Zizek is really very helpful. I found Giegerich to be very helpful in understanding Giegerich and understanding how the dialectic functions, both psychologically, but also in culturally, politically. So, and Giegerich is a psychoanalyst, so that comes in handy. And I know oftentimes at people who, like at ISPDI conferences, when we're hearing papers, people, they do refer to Giegerich quite a bit to help, I think, illustrate the dialectic.
Eu queria que você falasse um pouco do teu encontro com o Giegerich, com as ideias do Giegerich, e qual é a tua experiência na sociedade de psicologia da disciplina da interioridade. Como é que você acha que funciona essa instituição, o papel do Greg Mogenson, como é que tem sido para você participar desse movimento?
Well, I have enjoyed it. You know, it's a fairly small group. I think people in the society have, for whatever reason, a fascination with Giegerich. They really appreciate the work, and it's, you know, it feels almost like, how would you say, like nerds, you know, like people who are just really into philosophy. They like Hegelian philosophy, but I think also they appreciate the new perspective that Giegerich brings to Jungian analytical psychology. I enjoy my work there at the ISPDI. I'm on the executive committee. I'm the treasurer, and Greg Mogenson is the vice president. John Hodel is the president. I mean, they're very, you know, Marco, I don't know if Marco Benedetto he's also on the executive committee. I'm not sure if you know Marco.
Marco Heleno
yeah.
Barreto.
So it's a fun group. I enjoy it. We have conferences every year. We just had a conference in the summer. It was all virtual, so we had, you know, 2 or 3 days of papers, people giving papers. It was fun. So I'm not sure, was that your question?
E o teu encontro com o texto do Giegerich? O que te fez? Você tem uma formação junguiana. O que te fez te aproximar das ideias do Giegerich?
Ah, I see. Okay. You know, I studied Hillman. I was in love with Hillman for several years, and very enchanted by James Hillman and archetypal psychology. And I was introduced to Giegerich by a friend who said, hey, you should read this interesting essay. And I think actually one of the first essays I read on Giegerich was his critique of the Red Book, which shocked me. I was shocked. And then I went to a conference and Giegerich was there. He gave a paper and critiqued Jung. And I'm not sure if you've read this one where the critique of Jung, where Jung was so afraid remember when he was a kid, he saw God shit on the chapel. He had that horrible vision, and he didn't want to let himself have the rest of it. I mean, God was sitting on a throne, you know, in a toilet above the chapel in the town. Anyway, Giegerich critiqued the whole of analytical psychology as, in a sense, a neurotic attempt to sort of fix that, to reconcile that original experience that Jung had, and rather than really allow the truth of that vision to be reality, which is that God is no longer holds the position that he had historically. So anyway, I heard that and I was, wow, it really shocked me. And I think it was exciting to me, this new perspective. and rather than resisting the movement of history, to actually observe it and look at the meaning of it. And even possibly see the soul's expression in these modern advances in our times and things like that. So anyway, I really enjoyed, and I actually did meet him. I've met him a couple times, and he's very warm and kind, as a person. So I don't know.
Claro, claro. Queria te agradecer pela tua presença. É interessante, nós tivemos aqui no Tiaços, conversando conosco, vários junguianos que foram alvo da letra ácida do Giegerich, como Robert Romaninchi, Mark Saban, e todos eles, quando perguntados sobre o debate com Giegerich, eles dizem que o Romaninchi disse que ele não teve fôlego para responder às questões. O Mark Saban falou também que ele foi tomado por alguma coisa, deixou passar, mas, enfim, a gente sabe que a pena, né, a letra do Giegerich é uma letra muito dura, mas ela fica claramente no campo das ideias e é importante manter esse debate no campo intelectual. Enfim, queria te agradecer, Jennifer. É uma oportunidade extremamente nova para a gente que estamos aqui ainda começando a estudar o Giegerich. O André Dantas, que está aqui, traduziu o livro, é um dos grandes expoentes, talvez seja, junto com o Marco Heleno Barreto, uma das pessoas que melhor domina o texto. Então, a gente está tentando ainda ganhar intimidade com a obra do Giegerich, e a tua presença aqui só nos ajuda nisso. Queria agradecer a tua presença, obrigado pela tua disponibilidade. Se você quiser falar alguma coisa para a gente, fique à vontade.
Well, I feel very fortunate to be able to speak to you, and I appreciate very much the depth and sophistication of the questions. It seems like you have a very vibrant, stimulating community in this group, and I would love to come back someday and talk some more, but it's really been my pleasure. So thank you.
Convite feito. Ano que vem a gente combina de você voltar para falar conosco.
Ok.
Obrigado pela tua presença, Jennifer. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. Queria agradecer novamente pela oportunidade de vocês estarem aqui conosco. Agradecer a Luciana Ximenes, companheira do Tiaços. Agradecer a Isa por essa árdua tarefa de traduzir essas ideias novas. E já convidar a todos para a semana que vem assistir a palestra do Edward Cayce. E a gente vai começar a finalizar as palestras do Tiaços ano que vem. Obrigado, Jennifer. Boa sorte. Pessoal, boa noite. Até a próxima.
Thank you.
Tchau, tchau.